The rain hammered against the windows of the Kentucky State Police headquarters as Detective Sarah Morgan stared at the missing persons files spread across her desk. 23 faces looked back at her from faded photographs, each one a member of the Eternal Light Fellowship who had simply vanished without a trace over the past 27 years. What she didn't know was that these disappearances weren't random. They were part of a systematic pattern that would lead her to uncover one of the most disturbing religious conspiracies in American history. Before we dive into this chilling investigation, I need to ask you something. Are you prepared to hear about secrets that have been buried for decades? If you're ready to uncover the truth that powerful people tried to hide, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Tell me in the comments what state you're listening from. I have a feeling this story will resonate with you more than you might expect. The Eternal Light Fellowship seemed like any other religious community when it first appeared in the rolling hills of eastern Kentucky in 1995. Founded by a charismatic preacher named Brother Elijah Thorne, the group attracted families seeking spiritual fulfillment and a simpler way of life. Their compound, nestled in a valley 40 miles from the nearest town, consisted of modest wooden buildings, vegetable gardens, and a small chapel where members gathered for daily prayers. Brother Elijah was everything a spiritual leader should appear to be. At 52, he possessed the kind of commanding presence that made people want to follow him. His steel gray hair was always perfectly groomed. His voice carried the authority of someone who spoke directly with God, and his penetrating blue eyes seemed to see into the very souls of those who sought his guidance. He had arrived in Kentucky with impeccable credentials, claiming to have ministered to congregations in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia before receiving what he called a divine calling to establish a community in the Kentucky mountains. The fellowship's early days were marked by genuine spiritual enthusiasm. Members shared their resources, worked together to build their community, and participated in worship services that neighbors described as passionate but not unusual for rural Kentucky's religious landscape. Local authorities had no reason to be suspicious. The group paid their taxes, caused no trouble, and even contributed to local charities. When members occasionally left the community, Brother Elijah would explain that they had been called to serve elsewhere, or had decided the communal lifestyle wasn't for them. What no one realized was that Brother Elijah Thorne was not his real name. He had been born Marcus Whitfield in Cleveland, Ohio in 1943, and his path to religious leadership had been anything but conventional. Court records sealed for decades would later reveal that Whitfield had been arrested twice in the 1970s for fraud and once for assault, though charges were dropped each time due to lack of evidence or witness intimidation. More disturbing was his connection to a religious group in Pennsylvania that had been investigated for financial irregularities and allegations of abuse before mysteriously disbanding in 1994. The transformation of Marcus Whitfield into Brother Elijah Thorne had been methodical and calculated. He had studied successful religious movements, practiced his preaching style, and even underwent cosmetic surgery to alter his appearance. When he arrived in Kentucky, he brought with him not just a new identity, but a carefully crafted theology that would serve his true purposes. The Eternal Light Fellowship's doctrine emphasized complete surrender to God's will as interpreted through Brother Elijah, the importance of cutting ties with the corrupt outside world, and the necessity of making personal sacrifices for the greater good of the community. The first disappearance occurred in the spring of 1996, less than a year after the fellowship's establishment. Sister Mary Catherine Henley, a 34-year-old widow who had joined the group with her 2 young children, was reported missing by her brother in Louisville. When police visited the compound, Brother Elijah explained that Sister Mary had received a calling to missionary work in Central America and had departed with another member who shared her vision. He produced a letter supposedly written by Sister Mary, expressing her joy at this new opportunity and asking her family not to worry about her. The letter, written in neat handwriting on fellowship letterhead, seemed genuine enough. It contained personal details that only Sister Mary would know and was signed with her distinctive signature. What investigators didn't realize was that Brother Elijah had been carefully studying his followers' handwriting for months, practicing their signatures and learning to mimic their writing styles. The letter was a forgery, skillfully crafted to deflect suspicion while providing a plausible explanation for Sister Mary's disappearance. Over the following months, similar disappearances occurred with disturbing regularity. Brother Thomas Ashford, a skilled carpenter who had been instrumental in building the fellowship's facilities, allegedly received a calling to help establish a sister community in Montana. Sister Rebecca Walsh, a nurse who had been treating community members' medical needs, was said to have been called to serve in a missionary hospital in Guatemala. Each disappearance was accompanied by a carefully forged letter and a reasonable explanation that satisfied most inquiries. The pattern might have continued indefinitely if not for the persistence of Detective Sarah Morgan, who had been assigned to investigate the disappearances in 2018. Morgan, a 20-year veteran of the Kentucky State Police, had developed an instinct for cases that didn't add up. The sheer number of missing persons connected to the fellowship struck her as statistically impossible. Religious communities, even insular ones, typically experienced some turnover, but the Eternal Light Fellowship was losing members at a rate that defied explanation. Morgan's investigation began with a simple question: where were the families of the missing? In most cases, people who join religious communities maintain some contact with relatives, even if it's minimal. But the fellowship's disappeared members seem to have vanished from the earth entirely. Phone calls went unanswered, letters were returned as undeliverable, and attempts to trace their movements beyond the compound's gates led nowhere. The breakthrough came when Morgan decided to examine the fellowship's financial records. Religious organizations are required to file certain documents with state authorities, and the fellowship's filings revealed some interesting patterns. Despite claiming to be a simple farming community, the group had significant cash assets and regularly made large purchases of supplies that seemed excessive for their stated membership. More puzzling were regular payments to a company called Mountain Transport Services, which claimed to provide moving services for religious communities, but had no verifiable business address. Morgan's investigation of Mountain Transport Services led her to a disturbing discovery. The company was registered to a man named David Crow, who had a criminal record including convictions for fraud and racketeering. When Morgan attempted to locate Crow, she found that he had died in a car accident in 2015, but not before providing some crucial information to a federal investigator who had been tracking his activities. According to the federal files, which Morgan obtained through a complicated interagency request, Crow had been involved in what he called relocation services for various religious groups. His business model was simple. He would help communities dispose of problems that might attract unwanted attention from authorities. These problems, according to Crow's coded language, included members who had become disillusioned with community leadership, those who threatened to expose financial irregularities, and individuals who possessed knowledge that could damage the group's reputation. The files contained references to at least 12 different religious communities across the southeastern United States, all of which had employed Crow's services at various times. The Eternal Light Fellowship was listed as one of his most consistent clients, with payments dating back to 1996. The amounts were substantial, suggesting that whatever services Crow provided were both extensive and expensive. Morgan's investigation now shifted from missing persons to something far more sinister. If Crow's files were accurate, the fellowship wasn't simply a religious community with an unusually high turnover rate. It was a criminal organization that had been systematically eliminating members who posed threats to its operations. The question was, what operations were so sensitive that they required murder to protect them? The answer began to emerge when Morgan obtained a warrant to search the fellowship's financial records more thoroughly. What she discovered was a complex web of illegal activities that had been operating under the cover of religious practice for more than 2 decades. The fellowship was involved in money laundering, tax evasion, and fraud on a massive scale. They had been taking advantage of religious exemptions to avoid oversight while running what amounted to a criminal enterprise. But the financial crimes, as serious as they were, paled in comparison to what Morgan discovered next. Hidden in the fellowship's records were references to something called the Purification Program, which appeared to be a systematic method of eliminating members who posed risks to the organization. The program had been operating since the fellowship's early days and had claimed the lives of at least 23 people over the years. The Purification Program worked through a carefully orchestrated process. Members who were identified as problems would first be isolated from the rest of the community through what was called special spiritual counseling. They would be moved to a separate facility on the compound's grounds, where they would undergo what Brother Elijah described as intensive prayer and meditation designed to cleanse their souls of doubt and negativity. In reality, the special facility was a prison where targeted members were held against their will, while Brother Elijah and his inner circle decided their fate. Those who could be convinced to remain silent about what they had seen or learned would eventually be released back into the community with strict monitoring. Those who remained defiant or who possessed information that could seriously damage the fellowship would be selected for what Brother Elijah called translation to the higher realm. The translation process was murder disguised as religious ritual. Victims would be told that they had been chosen for a special honor, that their souls were ready to ascend to a higher plane of existence. They would be given what they believed was a sacred sacrament, but was actually a lethal dose of poison. Their deaths would be explained to the community as miraculous ascensions, with the bodies quickly disposed of to prevent any investigation. Morgan's investigation revealed that the Fellowship had developed sophisticated methods for disposing of evidence. Bodies were cremated in a specially constructed furnace on the compound, with the ashes scattered in remote areas of the Kentucky mountains. Personal belongings were destroyed or donated to charity in distant cities. Any traces of the victim's existence were systematically eliminated, making it appear as though they had simply vanished into thin air. The scope of the conspiracy extended far beyond the Fellowship's leadership. Local officials had been corrupted, federal agencies had been deceived, and a network of associates in other states had helped facilitate the cover-up. The investigation revealed that Brother Elijah had been paying bribes to county officials, state legislators, and even federal investigators to ensure that inquiries into the Fellowship's activities were quickly dismissed or redirected. Detective Morgan's investigation had uncovered one of the most sophisticated criminal conspiracies in American religious history. The Eternal Light Fellowship had been operating as a death cult for more than 2 decades, systematically murdering members who threatened to expose their illegal activities. The 23 confirmed victims were likely just at the beginning, as evidence suggested that similar operations had been conducted at the Fellowship's previous locations in other states. The case that had begun with missing persons reports had evolved into something far more complex and disturbing. Morgan realized that she was dealing with a criminal organization that had perfected the art of hiding murder behind religious practice. The Fellowship's isolation, their claims of religious freedom, and their careful cultivation of political connections had created a perfect environment for systematic killing. As Morgan prepared to move forward with arrests and prosecutions, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had uncovered only part of the truth. The Fellowship's records contained references to other communities, other leaders, and other purification programs that suggested a network of similar operations across the country. The question that haunted her was whether the Eternal Light Fellowship was an isolated case or part of something much larger and more terrifying. The investigation that had started with 23 missing persons had revealed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and religious authority. The victims had been ordinary people seeking spiritual fulfillment who had instead found themselves trapped in a nightmare of manipulation, abuse, and murder. Their disappearances had been carefully orchestrated to avoid detection, their deaths disguised as religious experiences, and their memories systematically erased to protect the criminals who had killed them. But Detective Sarah Morgan's persistence and dedication had finally brought their story to light. The missing faces on her desk were no longer just statistics or cold cases. They were victims of a crime that had been hidden for decades behind the facade of religious freedom and spiritual seeking. Their voices, silent for so long, would finally be heard as the truth about the Eternal Light Fellowship emerged from the shadows where it had been hidden for 27 years. The Kentucky hills that had once seemed like a peaceful refuge for those seeking spiritual truth had concealed one of the most systematic and calculated killing sprees in American history. The Eternal Light Fellowship's reign of terror was finally coming to an end, but the questions it raised about religious freedom, government oversight, and the vulnerability of those who seek meaning in isolated communities would continue to resonate long after the last arrest was made. As Detective Morgan's investigation deepened into the Eternal Light Fellowship, the true scope of Brother Elijah's operation began to emerge through a series of disturbing discoveries that would challenge everything she thought she knew about organized crime in rural America. The compound's financial records, meticulously maintained by the fellowship's treasurer, Sister Ruth, revealed a sophisticated money laundering scheme that had been operating under the cover of religious donations for nearly 2 decades. The breakthrough came when Morgan discovered a hidden room beneath the fellowship's main chapel, accessible only through a concealed entrance behind the altar. Inside, she found detailed records of every member who had undergone the purification program since 1995, including photographs taken before and after the process. The transformation was shocking. Vibrant, healthy individuals had been reduced to hollow-eyed shells of their former selves, their bodies bearing the unmistakable signs of systematic abuse and malnutrition. But it was the discovery of Brother Elijah's personal journal that truly revealed the depth of his depravity. Written in his own hand, the journal detailed his philosophy of spiritual cleansing through suffering, describing in clinical terms how pain and deprivation could be used to break down an individual's resistance and rebuild them as perfect vessels for his will. The entries revealed a man who had studied psychological manipulation techniques with the dedications of a scholar, combining elements of religious mysticism with modern brainwashing methods to create a system of control that was both elegant and terrifying. The journal entries from 1998 were particularly disturbing. Brother Elijah had written extensively about his experiments with different forms of spiritual counseling, documenting how various combinations of isolation, sleep deprivation, and controlled substances could be used to induce states of religious ecstasy that made his followers more susceptible to his influence. He described these sessions with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying laboratory animals, noting which techniques produced the most dramatic results and how they could be refined for maximum effectiveness. Morgan's investigation revealed that the fellowship's recruitment strategy had been carefully designed to target the most vulnerable members of society. They specifically sought out individuals who were experiencing major life transitions, recent losses, or psychological trauma. The initial approach was always gentle and supportive, offering community and purpose to those who felt lost and alone. Only after potential recruits had been thoroughly integrated into the group's social structure would they be gradually introduced to the more extreme aspects of the fellowship's beliefs. The process of indoctrination was methodical and patient. New members would first participate in seemingly innocent group activities, prayer circles, and community service projects. These activities were designed to create strong emotional bonds with other members while simultaneously isolating recruits from their outside support networks. Family members and friends who expressed concern about the new members' involvement with the fellowship were systematically demonized as agents of spiritual corruption who needed to be avoided for the individual's own spiritual protection. As Morgan delved deeper into the fellowship's operations, she discovered that Brother Elijah had established connections with similar organizations across the country. The network operated through a system of carefully coded communications, with leaders sharing information about recruitment techniques, methods of control, and strategies for avoiding law enforcement attention. The scale of the operation was staggering, with evidence suggesting that similar groups were operating in at least 12 states, all following the same basic template that had been perfected at the Eternal Light Fellowship. The financial aspect of the operation was equally sophisticated. The Fellowship had established a complex web of shell corporations and charitable organizations that allowed them to move money without detection. Donations from members were funneled through these entities before being invested in legitimate businesses, creating a steady stream of income that funded the organization's expansion. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that the Fellowship had been selling access to their members to wealthy individuals who were interested in experiencing the power of absolute control over other human beings. Detective Morgan's investigation uncovered a client list that included prominent businessmen, politicians, and even members of law enforcement from across the region. These individuals had paid substantial fees for the opportunity to participate in the Fellowship's purification ceremonies, experiencing firsthand the intoxicating rush of wielding complete power over another person's physical and psychological well-being. The payments were disguised as donations to the Fellowship's various charitable endeavors, creating a perfect cover for what was essentially a sophisticated form of human trafficking. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking. Brother Elijah had cultivated relationships with officials at every level of government, from local police chiefs to federal bureaucrats. These relationships were maintained through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and the strategic placement of Fellowship members in key positions. The organization had become so deeply embedded in the local power structure that it had achieved a form of institutional immunity, operating with impunity for decades while authorities looked the other way. As Morgan worked to build her case, she discovered that several of her own colleagues had been compromised by the Fellowship's influence. Evidence suggested that at least 3 members of her department had been receiving regular payments from the organization in exchange for information about ongoing investigations. The revelation that corruption had penetrated her own agency added a new dimension of danger to her investigation, as she realized that her activities were likely being monitored and reported back to Brother Elijah. The psychological profiles of the Fellowship's victims revealed a disturbing pattern of systematic destruction. Members who had undergone the complete purification program exhibited symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, including dissociation, memory gaps, and an inability to form normal emotional attachments. Many had been so thoroughly broken by their experiences that they were unable to function independently, making them completely dependent on the Fellowship for their basic needs. The medical records that Morgan obtained through her investigation painted a horrifying picture of the physical abuse that had occurred within the compound. Members who had been subjected to the purification program showed evidence of repeated injuries, malnutrition, and exposure to toxic substances. The Fellowship's medical staff, led by a doctor who had lost his license in another state due to malpractice, had been conducting unauthorized experiments on members under the guise of spiritual healing. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of the Fellowship's breeding program. Brother Elijah had identified certain members as having desirable genetic traits and had orchestrated their reproduction through a system of arranged marriages and controlled breeding. Children born into the fellowship were separated from their parents at an early age and raised in communal nurseries where they were subjected to intensive indoctrination from birth. These children, now adults, had never known any life outside the fellowship and were among the most fanatically devoted members of the organization. The investigation revealed that the fellowship had been planning a major expansion of their operations, with documents indicating their intention to establish compounds in at least 5 additional states over the next decade. The organization had been stockpiling weapons, supplies, and cash in preparation for what Brother Elijah described in his writings as the Great Purification, a final confrontation with the outside world that would establish the fellowship as the dominant force in American religious life. As Detective Morgan prepared to move against the fellowship, she realized that she was confronting something far more dangerous than a simple cult. The Eternal Light Fellowship had evolved into a sophisticated criminal organization that combined religious extremism with organized crime, human trafficking, and domestic terrorism. The investigation had revealed not just the crimes of one charismatic leader, but a systemic failure of American institutions to protect vulnerable citizens from those who would exploit their faith for personal gain. The evidence that Morgan had gathered painted a picture of an organization that had successfully corrupted the very systems designed to prevent such abuses. The fellowship's network of influence extended into law enforcement, government, and the judicial system, creating a web of complicity that had allowed their crimes to continue undetected for decades. The realization that such an organization could operate with impunity in modern America was perhaps the most disturbing discovery of all. As Morgan prepared for the final phase of her investigation, she knew that bringing down the fellowship would require not just gathering evidence of their crimes, but dismantling an entire network of corruption that had enabled those crimes to occur. The stakes had never been higher, and the battle ahead would test not just her skills as an investigator, but her faith in the very institutions she had sworn to serve and protect. The Eternal Light Fellowship represented a unique form of American evil, one that had learned to hide behind the sacred symbols of faith and community while perpetrating acts of unspeakable cruelty. The investigation had revealed how easily the language of salvation could be twisted into a tool of oppression, and how the human desire for meaning and belonging could be exploited by those with the knowledge and will to do so. As Morgan prepared to confront this darkness, she understood that the outcome would determine not just the fate of the fellowship's victims, but the integrity of the systems designed to protect all Americans from those who would prey upon their deepest spiritual needs. Detective Sarah Morgan's investigation had led her to the most dangerous discovery of her career. The Eternal Light Fellowship wasn't just a religious community hiding crimes. It was the cornerstone of a nationwide network that had been operating in plain sight for decades, protected by a web of corruption that extended into the highest levels of American institutions. The breakthrough came when Morgan discovered a coded ledger hidden in Brother Elijah's private quarters. The entries revealed a systematic operation that made their local crimes seem almost insignificant by comparison. The fellowship had been coordinating with similar groups across 12 states, sharing resources, techniques, and most disturbingly, victims. The ledger contained shipping manifests disguised as religious supply orders. Young women being transferred between facilities under the guise of missionary work, financial records showing payments to judges, sheriffs, and federal officials who had protected the network for years. Most chilling were the coded references to breeding programs and medical experiments being conducted at facilities from California to Florida. Morgan realized she was looking at evidence of what might be the largest organized crime syndicate in American history, one that had hidden behind religious freedom and charitable work while trafficking hundreds of people and corrupting entire government agencies. The deeper she dug, the more the pattern became clear. The fellowship's methods had been refined over decades. They targeted isolated communities, established legitimate-seeming religious organizations, and systematically identified vulnerable individuals. Single mothers, runaways, immigrants, and the mentally ill were prime targets. The purification program was just one method among many. Others included forced labor camps disguised as rehabilitation centers, adoption rings that sold children to wealthy buyers, and medical research programs that used unwilling subjects. Brother Elijah's true identity emerged from FBI files that had been sealed for national security reasons. Marcus Whitfield had been a CIA operative in the 1960s, involved in psychological research programs that had been officially discontinued but had apparently continued under private funding. His expertise in mind control and behavioral modification had been perfect for building the fellowship's indoctrination methods. The network's protection came from systematic blackmail and bribery. They had compromised officials by providing them with victims, recording the encounters, and using the evidence to ensure silence and cooperation. Several prominent senators, federal judges, and law enforcement officials had been trapped in this web for decades. Morgan's investigation revealed that the fellowship had been responsible for over 400 disappearances across the country since 1985. Many victims had been sold into sexual slavery or forced labor. Others had been used in medical experiments that violated every ethical standard. The most disturbing revelation was that some had been killed simply to harvest their organs for wealthy buyers who paid premium prices for fresh transplants. The financial scope was staggering. The network had generated over $200 million in the past decade alone through human trafficking, organ sales, drug manufacturing, and money laundering. They had used this wealth to expand their operations and deepen their political protection. As Morgan compiled her evidence, she realized she was in immediate danger. The network had survived for so long because they eliminated threats efficiently and ruthlessly. 3 FBI agents who had previously investigated similar operations had died in apparent accidents. A federal prosecutor who had started asking questions about missing persons cases had suffered a fatal heart attack at age 35. The turning point came when Morgan discovered that the network was planning a massive expansion. They intended to establish new facilities in rural areas across the Midwest, taking advantage of economic desperation to recruit both victims and local officials. The plan, codenamed Harvest Moon, would potentially put thousands more lives at risk. Morgan faced an impossible choice. If she followed proper channels, the evidence would likely disappear and the network would eliminate her before she could act. But if she went public without official backing, she would be dismissed as a conspiracy theorist, while the criminals escaped justice. She decided to take a calculated risk. Working with a small team of trusted agents, she began building cases against lower-level operatives while secretly documenting everything. The plan was to create so much evidence that the network couldn't suppress it all, then coordinate simultaneous raids across multiple states. The operation required months of careful preparation. Morgan's team identified key facilities, mapped the network's structure, and built relationships with local law enforcement officers who weren't compromised. They also reached out to investigative journalists who could ensure the story would become public, regardless of official attempts at suppression. The network's response was swift and vicious. Morgan's partner was killed in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. Her apartment was broken into and searched. Anonymous threats arrived warning her to abandon the investigation. The message was clear: back off or face the consequences. But Morgan had anticipated this reaction. She had already distributed copies of her evidence to multiple secure locations and had arranged for automatic release if anything happened to her. The network's attempt at intimidation had only strengthened her resolve. The final phase of her investigation revealed the most shocking truth of all. The Eternal Light Fellowship Network wasn't just a criminal organization. It was connected to legitimate businesses, universities, and government agencies that had been unknowingly or knowingly supporting their operations. Major corporations had been purchasing products made by forced labor. Medical schools had been receiving organs without questioning their source. Government contracts had been awarded to companies that were fronts for the network. The corruption ran so deep that exposing it would potentially destabilize entire sectors of American society. The network had become integrated into the fabric of the country, making it nearly impossible to eliminate without causing massive collateral damage. As Morgan prepared for the final confrontation, she knew that success would require more than just arrests. The entire system would need to be dismantled piece by piece, with new safeguards put in place to prevent similar networks from emerging. The cost would be enormous, but the alternative, allowing this evil to continue, was unthinkable. The 312 people who had vanished from the Kentucky religious community were just the beginning. The true scope of the network's crimes would shock the nation and force a reckoning with how such systematic evil could have operated undetected for so long. The investigation had revealed that the greatest threat to American freedom wasn't foreign enemies or natural disasters. It was the corruption of the very institutions meant to protect the innocent. The Eternal Light Fellowship had shown how religious freedom could be perverted, how law enforcement could be compromised, and how the vulnerable could be exploited by those who understood the system's weaknesses. As Morgan stood on the brink of exposing this vast conspiracy, she realized that the real battle was just beginning. Taking down the network would require not just law enforcement action, but a fundamental reform of how America protected its most vulnerable citizens from those who would exploit them in the name of faith, science, or profit. The 312 disappeared souls deserved justice, but they also deserved a system that would prevent future victims from suffering the same fate. Morgan's investigation had revealed the problem. Now came the far more difficult task of finding a solution. The darkness that began in those Kentucky hills in 1962 would ultimately consume not just the Eternal Light Fellowship, but entire communities across 12 states. As Detective Sarah Morgan's investigation reached its climax, she discovered that what she had uncovered was not simply a religious cult gone wrong, but the epicenter of a criminal empire that threatened the very foundations of American society. The final confrontation came on a bitter December morning in 1989 when federal agents surrounded the main compound outside Millbrook. Brother Elijah Thorne, the man who had once been Marcus Whitfield, stood in the Central Assembly Hall surrounded by his most devoted followers. The decades had transformed him from a charismatic CIA operative into something far more sinister. His once commanding presence now radiated an otherworldly malevolence that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the compound. "You have served faithfully," Thorne announced to the 300 followers gathered before him, his voice carrying the same hypnotic quality that had entranced thousands over the years. But the time for earthly service has ended. The purification program requires one final sacrifice. What happened next would haunt the FBI agents who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. The mass suicide began with the children. Parents administered the specially prepared communion wine to their sons and daughters first, believing they were sending them to a higher realm. The poison, a cocktail of cyanide and sedatives that Sister Margaret had perfected over decades of experimentation, worked quickly. Within minutes, the compound's nursery fell silent. The adults followed, each drinking from the chalice with expressions of religious ecstasy, even as their bodies began to convulse. Detective Morgan, watching through binoculars from the federal command post, witnessed the systematic destruction of an entire community. "Stop this madness," she shouted into her radio, but it was too late. The compound's security forces had sealed all exits, and any attempt to breach the perimeter would likely result in an armed confrontation that could claim even more lives. Brother Elijah saved himself for last, standing among the bodies of his followers as federal agents finally breached the compound walls. But instead of the expected defiance or remorse, he smiled with genuine satisfaction. "You understand nothing," he told the agents as they placed him in custody. "This is not an ending. This is a beginning. The seeds we have planted will grow in ways you cannot imagine." His words proved prophetic. The investigation that followed the Millbrook massacre revealed a network of corruption that extended far beyond anything Morgan had initially suspected. The fellowship's financial records, recovered from hidden vaults throughout the compound, documented payments to officials at every level of government. Senators, judges, FBI directors, and even members of the presidential administration had accepted bribes in exchange for protection and information. The medical experiments conducted on fellowship members had produced research that influenced legitimate scientific studies for decades. Universities across the country discovered that their psychology, pharmacology, and behavioral science departments had unknowingly built upon data gathered through torture and murder. The ethical implications sent shockwaves through the academic community and forced a complete reevaluation of research standards. More disturbing was the discovery of the fellowship's recruitment and training programs. Hidden within the compound's underground facilities, investigators found detailed manuals for establishing similar operations in other locations. The organization had been systematically training leaders to create satellite communities, each designed to appear as legitimate religious or charitable organizations while serving as cover for criminal activities. They weren't just running a cult, Morgan explained to congressional investigators during the hearings that followed. They were franchising evil. Every technique they developed, every method of control and exploitation was being packaged and distributed to create identical operations across the country. The scope of the revelation was staggering. The Fellowship had established connections with organized crime syndicates, international human trafficking networks, and even foreign intelligence services. The political fallout was immediate and devastating. 3 senators resigned in disgrace after their connections to the Fellowship were exposed. A federal judge was impeached and removed from office. The FBI director was forced to retire early, and an entire generation of intelligence operatives found their careers destroyed by association with the organization. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came from the Fellowship's computer systems, which contained detailed profiles of potential targets for future operations. The organization had been systematically identifying vulnerable communities across America, mapping their social structures, and preparing detailed plans for infiltration and control. Small towns in rural areas were particularly attractive targets, as their isolation made them ideal for the kind of systematic abuse that had characterized the Fellowship's operations. The list of potential targets included communities in Montana, Wyoming, the Dakotas, and Alaska. Each location had been studied with military precision, with detailed assessments of local law enforcement capabilities, economic conditions, and social vulnerabilities. The Fellowship had been preparing to expand their operations nationwide, potentially creating a network of controlled communities that could have affected hundreds of thousands of Americans. Detective Morgan's investigation had prevented this expansion, but at an enormous cost. The 300 deaths at Millbrook represented only a fraction of the Fellowship's victims over the decades. The organization's own records documented the systematic murder of more than 2,000 people since 1962, with thousands more subjected to various forms of abuse and exploitation. The survivors faced challenges that the American justice system was ill-equipped to address. Many had been born into the Fellowship and had never known life outside its controlled environment. They lacked basic education, social skills, and any understanding of the outside world. The process of rehabilitation and reintegration took years, with many never fully recovering from the psychological damage inflicted by decades of systematic abuse. The children who survived faced particular challenges. Many had been subjected to the Fellowship's educational programs, which combined legitimate learning with systematic indoctrination and psychological manipulation. Deprogramming these young victims required specialized treatment that simply didn't exist in 1989. The government was forced to develop entirely new therapeutic approaches, working with experts in cult psychology and trauma treatment to help these children reclaim their lives. The financial costs of the Fellowship's crimes were equally staggering. The organization had systematically defrauded government programs, diverted charitable donations, and operated illegal businesses that generated millions of dollars in untaxed revenue. The IRS estimated that the Fellowship had evaded more than $50 million in taxes over the decades, while their various criminal enterprises had generated profits exceeding $200 million. The money had been used to purchase properties, bribe officials, and fund the organization's expansion. But a significant portion had simply disappeared, transferred to offshore accounts that investigators were never able to trace. The fellowship's financial networks were so complex and well hidden that forensic accountants spent years trying to unravel them, ultimately recovering only a fraction of the stolen funds. The impact on American religious freedom was profound and lasting. The fellowship case prompted the first serious federal oversight of religious organizations since the founding of the Republic. Congress passed legislation requiring greater financial transparency from religious groups, mandating background checks for religious leaders, and establishing federal monitoring of communities that showed signs of isolation or abuse. These measures were controversial, with many legitimate religious organizations arguing that government oversight violated constitutional principles of religious freedom. But the horror of what had happened in Kentucky and across the fellowship's network of communities created a political consensus that some form of regulation was necessary to prevent future tragedies. The case also exposed the vulnerabilities in America's social safety net that had allowed the fellowship to operate undetected for so long. The organization had exploited gaps in communication between federal agencies, taking advantage of jurisdictional boundaries and bureaucratic inefficiencies to avoid detection. The reforms that followed included improved information sharing between agencies, better coordination of investigations, and the creation of specialized units trained to identify and investigate cult-related crimes. Detective Morgan's role in exposing the fellowship made her a national figure, but the experience took a profound personal toll. She had witnessed horrors that challenged her faith in human nature and in the institutions she had devoted her life to protecting. The knowledge that such evil could operate undetected for decades, protected by the very officials sworn to prevent it, left her questioning everything she had believed about American society. "I used to believe that our system worked," she told a reporter years later. "I thought that eventually the truth would come out and justice would prevail. The fellowship case taught me that evil can hide in plain sight, protected by respectability and institutional power. It can operate for decades, destroying lives and corrupting everything it touches, while good people look the other way because they can't believe such things are possible." The psychological impact on the investigating officers was severe. Many of the FBI agents who had worked the case required extensive counseling and therapy. Some never returned to active duty, unable to cope with what they had witnessed. The scenes at Millbrook, combined with the evidence of decades of systematic abuse, created trauma that lasted for years. The case also revealed the extent to which the fellowship had infiltrated American institutions beyond government and law enforcement. The organization had placed members in schools, hospitals, social services, and even other religious organizations. These infiltrators had used their positions to identify vulnerable individuals who could be recruited or exploited, creating a network of influence that extended far beyond the fellowship's official membership. The process of identifying and removing these infiltrators took years and was never fully completed. Some fellowship members had assumed false identities so completely that they had lost touch with their original allegiances. Others had been so thoroughly indoctrinated that they genuinely believed they were serving a higher purpose, even when their actions caused obvious harm. The Fellowship's influence on American popular culture was equally disturbing. The organization had systematically promoted certain ideas and values through their media operations, subtly shaping public opinion on issues ranging from individual rights to the role of government. Their publishing houses, television programs, and educational materials had reached millions of Americans, spreading ideas that served the organization's interests while appearing to promote legitimate political and social causes. The revelation of this cultural manipulation sparked debates about media ownership, educational standards, and the responsibility of institutions to verify the sources of information they disseminated. Universities discovered that textbooks and educational materials influenced by the Fellowship had been used in classrooms across the country for decades, potentially affecting the worldview of entire generations of students. The international implications of the Fellowship case were equally significant. The organization had established connections with similar groups in other countries, sharing techniques and resources in what amounted to a global network of cult-based criminal enterprises. The investigation revealed links to organizations in Canada, Mexico, and several European countries, suggesting that the Fellowship's influence extended far beyond American borders. Foreign governments that had unknowingly harbored Fellowship-connected organizations faced their own reckonings. The techniques of psychological manipulation and social control that the Fellowship had perfected were being used by similar groups worldwide, creating a pattern of abuse that transcended national boundaries. The case also exposed the vulnerabilities in international law enforcement cooperation that had allowed such networks to operate across borders. The reforms that followed included improved information sharing between countries, better coordinations of investigations, and the development of international protocols for dealing with cult-related crimes. As the 1990s progressed, the full scope of the Fellowship's crimes continued to emerge. New evidence surfaced regularly, revealing additional victims and expanding the understanding of the organization's operations. Cold cases from across the country were reopened as investigators realized that previously unsolved disappearances and suspicious deaths might be connected to the Fellowship's network. The organization had been particularly active in targeting Native American communities, taking advantage of the jurisdictional complexities of reservation law enforcement to operate with relative impunity. The systematic abuse of Native American children in Fellowship-run schools and programs represented a particularly dark chapter in the organization's history, one that reinforced patterns of cultural genocide that had persisted for generations. The legal proceedings that followed the Fellowship's exposure were complex and lengthy. The organization's surviving leaders faced multiple criminal charges, including murder, kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy. The trials were complicated by the fact that many of the crimes had been committed decades earlier, making evidence gathering and witness testimony challenging. Brother Elijah Thorne, despite his advanced age and deteriorating health, was determined to be competent to stand trial. His courtroom appearances were theatrical events, with Thorne using his considerable charisma to attempt to justify his actions and promote his twisted ideology. Even in custody, he maintained his hold over some followers who attended his trial daily and continued to view him as a religious leader rather than a criminal. The prosecution's case was overwhelming, supported by physical evidence, witness testimony, and the organization's own records. But Thorne's defense strategy was sophisticated, relying on arguments about religious freedom, government overreach, and the voluntary nature of fellowship membership. His attorneys argued that the organization's practices, while unconventional, were protected religious expressions that the government had no right to prohibit. This defense failed completely when confronted with the evidence of systematic murder, child abuse, and financial fraud. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Thorne was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that recognized both the severity of his crimes and his advanced age. The other fellowship leaders faced similar fates. Sister Margaret, whose medical experiments had tortured and killed hundreds of victims, received multiple life sentences. Brother Samuel, who had overseen the organization's financial operations, was sentenced to 50 years in prison. Dozens of other fellowship members received sentences ranging from 10 years to life, depending on their level of involvement in the organization's crimes. The civil litigation that followed was equally complex. Thousands of survivors and family members of victims filed lawsuits against the fellowship, seeking compensation for the harm they had suffered. The organization's assets were seized and liquidated, but the proceeds were insufficient to provide meaningful compensation to all the victims. The government faced its own legal challenges as victims' families filed lawsuits claiming that federal agencies had failed in their duty to protect American citizens from the fellowship's crimes. These cases were largely unsuccessful, but they highlighted the institutional failures that had allowed the organization to operate for so long. The fellowship case fundamentally changed how Americans thought about religious freedom and government oversight. The traditional American principle of religious tolerance was forced to confront the reality that some organizations used religious freedom as a shield for criminal activity. The balance between protecting legitimate religious expression and preventing abuse became a central concern of policymakers and legal scholars. The case also influenced international discussions about cult-related crimes and the responsibilities of governments to protect their citizens from exploitation. The United Nations established working groups to study the phenomenon of destructive cults and develop international protocols for prevention and response. As the 20th century drew to a close, the full impact of the fellowship case was still being felt. The organization had operated for nearly 3 decades, affecting thousands of lives and corrupting institutions across American society. The process of healing and reform would take even longer, requiring fundamental changes in how Americans thought about religious freedom, government oversight, and the protection of vulnerable populations. Detective Sarah Morgan retired from law enforcement in 1995, but she continued to work as a consultant and advocate for cult abuse victims. Her experiences with the fellowship case had made her one of the nation's leading experts on cult-related crimes, and she used that expertise to help other law enforcement agencies identify and investigate similar organizations. The fellowship compound in Kentucky was demolished in 1992, and the land was converted into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of the organization's crimes. The memorial includes a wall bearing the names of all known victims, though investigators believe that many names will never be known. The park serves as a reminder of the dangers of unchecked authority and the importance of protecting vulnerable members of society. The case of the Eternal Light Fellowship stands as one of the most significant criminal investigations in American history, not just for the number of victims or the durations of the crimes, but for what it revealed about the vulnerabilities in American society and institutions. It demonstrated how charismatic leaders could exploit religious freedom and social trust to create systems of control and abuse that operated for decades without detection. The lessons learned from the fellowship case continue to influence law enforcement, social services, and religious organizations today. The techniques of psychological manipulation and social control that the fellowship perfected are still used by similar groups, making the case study essential reading for anyone working to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation. The story of the Eternal Light Fellowship serves as a warning about the dangers of absolute authority and the importance of maintaining vigilance against those who would exploit trust and faith for their own purposes. It reminds us that evil can hide behind respectable facades, and that the price of freedom is indeed eternal vigilance. The 312 people who vanished in those Kentucky hills over 27 years were not just statistics, they were individuals with hopes, dreams, and families who loved them. Their disappearance represented not just personal tragedies, but a failure of the systems and institutions that should have protected them. By remembering their stories and learning from the circumstances that led to their deaths, we honor their memory and work to ensure that such tragedies never happen again.